I will spare you my terrible French and conduct this session in English. Great to see all of you again this morning. And I think we are looking forward to a really terrific panel. We have three really wonderful and powerful papers that deal with the question of rights and control in colonial cities. And just to remind you, I think we have had we've learned a lot about many different colonial cities, but we have also had two larger and more conceptual discussions in the past 24 hours. One was on the question that Brandon raised on the, what is a global city? How are colonial cities linked to the concept of global cities? And then the other question that we raised in the past day was, what is a colonial city? How do we define a colonial city? Yesterday we learned a lot when we looked at the economics of colonial cities. We learned a lot about their relationship to the hinterland, extracting resources from the hinterland, and then exporting these resources to other parts of the world. But if we think about it, that kind of relationship applies to many cities. I mean, in some ways, all cities have a colonial relationship to their hinterland. They extract resources into the hinterland. And then even if you think about particular nation states, you find cities in nation states that extract these resources from the hinterland and then more or less transfer them entirely to other parts of that nation state. So if you, for example, think about mining towns in the United States in the 19th century, these were places that extracted resources and almost entirely removed them to somewhere else, let's say to New York City or Boston or elsewhere. So the extraction of resources and the transfer of resources to somewhere else might not be sufficient to define colonial cities as we have discussed them here. But maybe the secret to defining colonial cities is a particular form of rule and control. And this is exactly what we're going to be dealing with in this session. And we very much invite you to make kind of general conceptual points about the papers that you're about to hear, meaning the audience. You're invited to make these contributions. We have, as I mentioned, three terrific speakers, and I will introduce them in turn. Our first speaker is Larissa Kopitov, who joins us from the University of South Florida, where she teaches African history, and Larissa received her PhD from New York University in African history, where she wrote an important dissertation on the history of citizenship, also the topic of her talk, the history of citizenship in Senegal in the 19th and early 20th century. Larissa.
Thank you. Is this working? Yes? Good. Okay. Well, thank you, Sven, and thank you again to the organizers and everyone that I've already been having fruitful conversations with over the last couple of days. I didn't write on my written copy of this paper, but I do want to stress this is a draft. Please don't send it out into the world or cite it without checking with me, because by the end of the day, some of my arguments may have changed. So, in fact, I sort of hope they do. That's kind of the point. So my paper examines two legal exceptions in the late 19th and early 20th century French Empire. And I put exceptions in quote marks here because one of the questions that I explore in the larger project of which this is a part is what it means to be an exception to the rule when that rule is undefined and constantly evolving. These two exceptions are the coastal trading posts turned colonial cities, and I'll come back to how I think of those, of Senegal's four communes, Saint-Louis, Gorée, Rufisque, and Dakar, and French India's five comptoirs, the most well-known of which probably is Pondichéry. In the late 19th century, residents of the communes and the comptoir could vote in local elections and elect deputies to the National Assembly in France. These were political rights not available to most French colonial subjects. And they were rights which were interpreted, at times, as implying full French citizenship. Those rights were geographically bound to the communes and comptoirs, setting the cities apart, legally and administratively, from surrounding areas and from the rest of the French Empire. And in both Senegal and India, the exercise of those political rights raised questions about how French civil status might conflict with religious legal codes, and more broadly, about what it meant to be a citizen in the French Empire. In 1931, French legal scholar Pierre d'Arrest wrote in a treatise on colonial law that throughout the French Empire, quote, any individual not governed by French civil law does not exercise French political rights. But Senegal's 4 communes and India's 5 comptoirs, he continued, constituted 2 significant exceptions to this rule, where even those who have retained their personal status and are governed by the customs of their race and religion are voters. It is undoubtedly, he wrote, an abnormal situation. It was a situation that had, by then, prompted decades of contentious debates, new laws and administrative decrees, and new ways of thinking about France's relationship with its subjects and citizens, and about the reach of French citizenship in principle and in practice. Is this better when it's further? Yeah. No. Good. Framing these debates about rights and citizenship that tied Senegal and India together were 2 arguments. First, that because of this contradictory coexistence of personal status and French political rights, Senegal's 4 communes and French India's 5 comptoirs constituted exceptions to some sort of rule that governed the French Empire. What that rule was, however, was often ill-defined, and it was constantly changing. The second argument was that explicit comparisons between the communes and comptoirs were useful and perhaps necessary for clarifying how those exceptions and rules function. So this comparison isn't a framework that I've come up with for trying to make sense of these histories. It's one that appears in many of the archival documents I've come across. And my emphasis here isn't really on making a comparison between these 2 cases, but looking at why and how these 2 cases led so many others, and particularly so many French officials and legal scholars, to make those sorts of comparisons. As administrators, legislators, magistrates, jurists, and colonial subjects and citizens sought to understand this supposedly exceptional status of the communes and the comptoirs, they also explored how such exceptions fit within a broader imperial landscape. And I would argue that looking at such exceptions to the rule can help us to make sense of some of the ambiguities that shaped law, administration, and rights throughout the French Empire. The details of this abnormal situation that has described emerged over the course of many decades. Those are long and complicated histories. I know they are much more complicated than what I'm giving you here today. I'd be happy to talk in greater detail about them, but given the scope of this conference, what I really want to try to do today is skip over some of the historical specificity and have a chance to explore the questions that were raised and to explore what was at stake for the French Empire in these exceptions. So there is a little history, but it's in the written version. Briefly, in the first half of the 19th century, a series of legal, administrative, and political institutions were introduced to the coastal settlements under French control in both Senegal and India, in an attempt to more closely link them to metropolitan France. Rather than actually clarifying the legal status or political rights of the people living there, however, these attempts to perhaps assimilate the communes and comptoirs to France raised more questions than they answered. Most notably when the French Civil Code and later voting rights and emancipation were extended to these territories. They're often referred to as extending the rights of French citizens. it was unclear if that meant actually extending citizenship. And the majority of the inhabitants of French India were Muslim and Hindu, and in French Senegal, the majority were Muslim, although there was also a large Christian community of both. And they had no interest in having their civil affairs governed by French law. But adherence to French civil law is considered a defining characteristic of the French citizen. So could the rights of French citizens be granted to those who didn't first renounce their personal status or adherence to these other legal codes? That was kind of unclear. Were measures such as emancipation and voting rights intended to apply to areas that were not yet under French control or would soon come under French control? That was unclear. In India, the French Comtois were surrounded by British territory, effectively isolating the areas and insulating France from debates about expanding rights beyond their borders. In Senegal, on the other hand, the path forward was unclear. After vigorous debate, emancipation and voting rights ended up being limited to the areas, for instance, that had been under French control in 1848, when those measures were passed. Although the presence of the British in India meant that France had no opportunities to expand its footprint in South Asia, it also meant that it didn't confront the many administrative challenges so apparent in Senegal that resulted from cities within a single colony operating under different legal regimes and with different political institutions from the rest of that colony. So by the beginning of the 20th century, throughout just about everywhere in the French Empire, non-Europeans in French colonies were considered French subjects and French nationals. They were not foreigners and they were not citizens. And the communes and the comptoirs appear increasingly out of place legally and politically. They administratively were governed like municipalities in France itself. And the way that, thinking about Sven's question yesterday about, are cities and colonies necessarily colonial cities? In terms of how that worked in the communes and comptoirs, in many ways, they're administratively creations of the French colonial state, whose boundaries really had little to do with the populations living within them and the populations that those boundaries divided. That certainly doesn't mean that there was, in any sense, full colonial control, even in these nodes of authority, hubs of the empire. Much of the experience of living in the communes had little to do with colonial rule. But just because these divisions that the colonial state instituted were in many ways arbitrary, doesn't mean that they didn't have very real consequences for the lives of those living in the communes and, for instance, the lives of those living just outside the border of Saint-Louis, but in the banlieue or the outskirts, who didn't share political rights and legal status that was a block away, claimed. And those boundaries were always changing. And as the 20th century began, the communes and the comptoirs really were increasingly regarded as relics of an empire that didn't exist anymore, one in which France had emphasized the universal applicability of its laws and, theoretically, had sought to assimilate its colonial subjects to its political traditions, rather than the French Empire, in which it was rapidly claiming control over millions of subjects who were never intended to hold the rights of French citizens. And the questions raised increasingly by the inhabitants of the communes and comptoirs really were pushing the French to more clearly define what were these rights of citizenship, and what do we do with this coexistence of the rights of citizens alongside Muslim law, for instance, religious status. Were these people French citizens by virtue of political rights they'd been granted, because the civil code had been extended to these colonies, what did it mean to exercise some of the rights of French citizens, but not to be French citizens? Could one do this while continuing, in the words of one colonial official, to avoid the French civil code, essentially to exempt oneself from French civil law? And over the course of, and this is covered in more detail in the written version of the paper, over the course of the late 19th and early 20th century, there are a series of attempts to reform the electoral systems in the communes and the Droit, either to rein in the rights that had been granted in this earlier incarnation of a more assimilationist empire, supposedly, or simply to clarify what these rights were, and to make this situation more logical and to bring it more in line with the rest of the empire, essentially to do away with the exceptions. And throughout this process, French officials and legal scholars and politicians are constantly comparing Senegal and India and trying to make sense of how the situation in one of these exceptions might shed light on the other or on the broader rules of law in the French Empire. For instance, an investigation in India in the 1890s that sought to catch false renunciants of customary law included a whole section of research into how voting lists were handled in Senegal. A 1905 report on Senegal's electoral regime discussed India's voting lists as a possible model for the communes. But continued confusion about how these exceptions worked made each one as much a cautionary tale as a model for how France might handle populations that occupied a space somewhere between subject and citizen, and that persistently and frustratingly for the French seemed to escape being properly counted, classified, etc. And for the French, really, the significance of these exceptions lay not in what was happening in the communes and the comptoir. These were small parts of the empire, and they weren't the most important parts. Really, the importance lay in the questions that these exceptions raised about how the rules were supposed to work. And, for instance, did inclusion on voting rolls imply other rights, like citizenship? What would be the political implications of extending or limiting electoral rights or citizenship in the empire? If one could exercise political rights in Pondicherry without renouncing one's personal status, how would adherence to French civil law be considered a central tenet of French citizenship anyway? And what's striking, this is wrapping up, what's striking in these two cases is that while colonial officials and legal scholars are constantly drawing comparisons between the two, they are quite vocal about the fact that this is really part of a larger project that has very little to do with the communes or the comptoir, but with either other theoretical questions in the empire, such as what about Algeria, or with questions of France itself. If one could be a French citizen in Senegal without ascribing fully to French law, what was French citizenship anyway? And what stands out in all of these efforts is that even in places like Saint-Louis and Dakar, where there are really hubs of French colonial control on paper, the fragility of the colonial state and the inability to keep track of subjects and citizens moving throughout French territories is something that France is very aware of and very concerned about what that means for the broader future of its empire or for French citizenship itself. Thank you.
Bonjour. Firstly, I would like to thank Professor Sven Wickett and Mamadou for hosting us. Thank you, sir, for giving us this opportunity. I first contextualize the geography because it may be new to somebody, to most of you. So this is the Eastern colonial bird, and this map is just to place how the European colonialism was placed within this geography. So we have the Indian subcontinent, the British, the Portuguese, the Dutch, the French, all four in the Indian subcontinent, and the Malaccas, and so this is just, and Mozambique, Portuguese. So this is just the bird's eye view of how colonialism was spread within the Eastern colonial, the Indian Ocean world, and the Pacific world. So zooming in, this is the Indian subcontinent. You have the British, which start in the Bengal region. You have Goa, which is of relevance to us. These are the Dutch, and you have Pondicherry, which was being discussed as the French colony. So this is the relative placement. Zooming in, you have Diu, you have Surat, you have Daman, and you have Bombay. So we will be talking about Bombay. And Goa and Bombay, these are two very important cities. Both were Portuguese colonies, and Bombay was given to the English through the marriage dowry of Catherine de Braganza in 1661 and given to the East India Company in 1668. So it had a very strong dual character. Just to contextualize more, this is the timeline of Portuguese and British colonialism in India. As you see, the Portuguese were at least 100 years before in India, and we tend to only talk about the British. And this selective amnesia in Indian history as such needs to be addressed, because they were before, and they had a lot of institutions which the British did borrow. So, as you see, 1661, Bombay Portuguese territory given to the British Crown. 1668, only £10 was the rent that the East India Company paid for colonized Bombay. So, Iberian Union, when the Portuguese were under Spanish domination, this is an important moment because the Portuguese start to lose a lot of territory to the Dutch in the 17th century because the Spanish say we don't care, and then they go into a treaty with the English, and that culminates in this the transfer of Bombay to the English. This is Bombay. We tend to not see Bombay as this. It's actually seven different islands, and then the land has been reclaimed from the waters, and this is what it looks like now. So that is why in the monsoon season, as it rains, Bombay goes first, because it's actually a land reclaimed from the waters through causeways. So you have Colaba, Old Woman Island, these were the main things. You would have heard about Garcia de Orta. He was one of the main Portuguese botanists. He was placed where the British arsenal was. This is one of the examples of showing that how Bombay has a very strong dual character. And this is an important character because being a former Portuguese colony, when the British came, they were appropriating and building up on Portuguese institutions. The name itself is Good Bay, it's Bombay. Bombay. So, and then you have these following terms, the friends from Brazil would actually very Foro, Pagar de Foro, Fazenda, Afaramento, these two are revenue tenures. This means quit rent and this estate. In Western colonial India, the British used these exact terms. So the vocabulary didn't change. Till today, some people actually got rent as foro. This is our main focus. So the early, I have this presentation in French also. When we'll be translating, I'll show you the French one. So everything is in French also. So as you would know that though the Portuguese were in Bombay, they did develop it. It was only under the British after 1668 and specifically Gerard Rongier who put a lot of effort to revive Bombay, but it's a very small thing. And once they get a good harbour, Bombay is a very good harbour, they had to control it and protect it. So the first form of protection was through this militia, and Bhandaris is a caste. So it started as Portuguese Eurasians, but they were then dominated by the Bhandaris. In 1720, this didn't work because it was still chaotic. So they had courts, which were with the Chief Justice as an English officer. And in these courts, you have veriadores or attorneys. Ironically, Villes is a very important component of Senado de Camara, Senado de Goa. So this is the Portuguese imprint on an English institution. After the court was made, the councillors were made as justices of peace. This is an important point. Once the Bhandari militia was removed, you have the whole concept of justices of peace. And though we have a parallel in England, it is totally new. Because as this report says, they were using powers which were not in their right itself. Being a judicial officer, they were also acting as an executive officer and making laws. So the whole separation of powers, the cry, came through this. In India, it became a very big issue. I can't go into it. The Macintosh report is there. There was a very big hue and cry that it can't be that a law and a judicial officer should be an executive officer also, and is making the law. In 1771, the British were very reluctant to invest too much in Bombay. So they said that let's do one thing, let's use the Portuguese institutions and use it as a policing administration. So Villes and the landed gentry was used. This is one of the British policies, to use zamindars under Hastings, abandoned by Cornwallis, to actually use the landed gentry as part of the policing administration, surveillance and control. This is a very interesting quote, because though we had justice of peace, this system didn't work, totally failed. So they introduced what is called the lieutenant of police, the military connotation. But within 10 years, the recorder's court said that this office can't work because it's public nuisance, because again, the lieutenant of peace was a justice of peace. He had judicial, executive and law-making powers. So it is at this intersection that there is tension. This is to show you how they were misusing their powers. It's a very interesting quote. And he could arrest 40 men in the morning, convict 10 men in the afternoon, and use the broil prerogative and pardon them. So this tension and these institutions then embody this tension. This is one of the points which I'm trying to. So this would be the overview of how the policing administration was changing. Militia, Bhandari, Justice of Peace, all 4 officers were still Justices of Peace, and this remains the problem. This is the problem, that they remain Justices of Peace. Act 5 of 1861, and then the professional police force is coming through, the Irish constabulary model is coming through, Robert Peel. So that is a different story altogether. This is specific to Bombay. This is an overview of Bengal. This I am trying to show you that how there is an overlap in jurisdiction. And the overlap is actually between judicial and revenue. Revenue being important to the British, very important to the British, and that is why such a complicated structure was created, with a district magistrate being a collector, also being a policing officer, also being a judicial officer. So this actually tells you something about. So this is the first part of the conclusion, which is that there is a constant flux. It is not really logical, it's back and forth, there are issues, there are conflicts. And the prime minister of the company and later the colonial state was economic. And this point is very important. These overlaps are considerable friction. I am emphasizing on this fact that there was considerable friction within the colonial state over the issue of how do we make the SP an officer who can execute but not have judicial powers. Coming to the Portuguese, which is, as I said, this is one unique part that I am trying to integrate the Portuguese into this narrative. Because what we do is that if we don't integrate Portuguese, we grant insularity to all the colonial institutions of the British. We think that it is only their experimentation and it is the metropolising. Ironically, it is not true. So this is an overview of the Portuguese. They had this tendency of having fortified settlements all through. They only expanded in Brazil more. Goa remained a small settlement. And ironically, the Governor General of Goa, his jurisdiction was from Sofala to Malacca. And this was one of the reasons they lost a lot of territory to the Dutch. Because Mozambique, all of these colonies, all these towns came under the Governor General of Goa. So how can he manage such a big empire? But they had a very big issue with population and they were never able to expand. This is Goa. Just to show you, this is called the old settlement. They came first here, but because of sanitary issues, it was very porous land, so it was going, the water became contaminated, so they moved downwards. just a more. So this is a snapshot of the Portuguese administration till 1820s. What you will see is that firstly, it's it's based on municipal corporations. It's council based, which was later picked up by the British. And second, this is Thanadar. This is a very important word because Thanadar word is in the British administration also, and both of them had the same thing. They were important policing officials. So they appropriated this, and factor is important because Mozambique, which is part of this continent, the factor of Mozambique was under Droit, and he was replicating these institutions there. Under the constitutional regime, after 1821, it became much more complex and much more representative. But here, what I want to emphasize is this officer called regidor. Regidor means magistrate. Ironically, the movement towards magistracy in policing in Bombay and Goa are coincidental. It's very close. It's within 6 years. Though the system was in Calcutta, they didn't introduce it. Only when there's a shift in Bombay and Goa together. So it shows a connection. Overt connection is difficult because the archives are different. One of the this is the Senato de Câmara, one of the main institutions in all Portuguese colony. This you will find in all Portuguese colony. The municipal corporation, Senato de Câmara, Senato de Goa, Senato de Lauda. I want to show 2 to 6 vereadores, councillors. This term is important because this again, the vereadores who are a very important part of Portuguese administration were present for at least 60 to 70 years in the British Empire, through the police. So there is an interaction. Coming to the conclusions, just last 2 slides. So this is a triangulation between the Portuguese, the British and the metropole. Based on general overview to administration, this shows that how the priorities are different. As you would notice that in Portuguese, there is no overlap with revenue administration. They kept the revenue administration totally different. But the British actually mixed it with the judiciary because their main interest was to extract a lot of revenue. So, second, there is a strong imprint of Portuguese administrative setup for English. So you have in vocabulary, then through intermediaries and 18th century, where those were important part. Third, that there is an intersection in strategies also. That is integrating local intermediaries in the form of fazendas, and you have the zamindars. Third, I could not emphasize this point more because the village administration both were identical. Both have said we will not restructure the village administration. Let's just connect to it and let this strategy was first used by the Portuguese and then the British were able to do. And significantly, and this I said that though there was magisterial system in Calcutta, it was not exported to Bombay during that period. It is only when Goa there is a shift, they changed it here. Fourth, and this is a methodological point which I wanted to make, which was that in global history we need to integrate empires. Which is to say that we can't study Bombay or the English Empire in the Indian subcontinent without studying the same thing for French, because the French also are very ignored in Indian history as such, and in global history. So a global history of India or the Indian subcontinent means a history which integrates all 3 empires, because there is interaction, there is flux. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Okay. This is an old photograph of Goa, painted.
So now you need to put the
French one. Okay. So for my French friends, everything in French. I hope the translation is okay. If it isn't, then you should catch Google, not me. You can start your translation.
Bonjour tout le monde. Alors, monsieur Abassé l'histoire nous avait proposé de mettre en place les 2 versions. C'est-à-dire en première position la version anglaise, ensuite la version française, après que tout le monde puisse voir. Il nous a demandé de ne pas faire une interprétation là-dessus. Bon, on va voir ensemble. Ok? Merci. You can go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead, sorry. This is the timeline in French.
Chronologie du colonialisme portugais et britannique.
1661, and this is what I was emphasizing, that Bombay went to the English in 1661. Then you have these, this is self-explanatory, and I don't know how to pronounce them.
Okay, I think we should let the translator speak, okay?
Certainement, ce n'est pas des termes que l'on traduit parce que c'est des termes qui sont typiquement de leur langue que je vois là-dedans. Parce que je ne vois pas une possibilité de les traduire en français. Okay? Mais quand il y a possibilité d'expliquer, on va s'expliquer ensemble. Okay? Alors, ça c'est la présentation du frère Warden, secrétaire en chef du gouvernement dans son rapport en 1809. En 1809. Alors, ici il nous présente ici la réorganisation de la police dans les années 1771. Comment la police a été organisée. Par exemple, là-bas, vous voyez 12 officiers et 100 hommes. Ces 100 hommes ne servaient rien d'autre que des hommes de garde qui gardaient, qui veillaient pour la sécurité. Okay? Il y a aussi 4 officiers et 33 hommes à Wechemen, c'est-à-dire c'est dans l'hôpital. Okay? Il y a aussi 4 officiers et 33 hommes à la maison du Major Mas. Et 4 officiers et 35 hommes à Mampadadi, Charles Moumpadeli. Voilà. Ça, c'est la statement de M. Diator. Il disait en tant que nuisance publique et son bureau étant une tendance très dangereuse, il a vivement recommandé de l'abolir comme étant propre à un gouvernement despotique où il passe-t-il et à portée de main pour faire respecter son autorité. Ça, le surintendant de la police pour arrêter 40 hommes le matin, puis juger les condamnés et les condamner à midi et terminer la journée en exerçant la prérogative royale de pardonner à leurs dégâts. Ça, c'est la présentation de l'administration de la police. Et en premier lieu, nous avons des ministres ou des supports en veilleur de nuit. Il y a le ministre, juge de paix, il y a lieutenant de police, député de police en haut gendarme, superintendant de police et commissaire de police. C'était l'organisation de la police administrative autant. Premièrement, le processus de colonisation n'était pas linéaire ni téléologique. Il n'y avait pas de plan établi et l'appareil du gouvernement était en constante mutation. Les Anglais ont mis un siècle à comprendre la structure actuelle de la police de l'institution évolue constamment en fonction des besoins de l'État colonial. Donc, c'est-à-dire, je peux faire un petit commentaire là-dessus. La structure actuelle de la police fonctionnait en besoin de la police, en besoin de consommer des fonctions de l'État colonial. Okay, they said that we need us to wait for them. They can't look at the door.
To wait for them.
Yes, need us to wait for them. Yes.
Can I go forward?
Yeah.
I don't understand. This is Goa. But I need to explain. This is Goa. This is Portuguese Empire. Goa zoom. This is the administrative setup. 1500.
La carte qu'il a montrée, c'est Goa, l'Empire portugais. Okay.
This is important, 2 slides. These are conclusions.
Okay. So why don't you all read this? I don't think you need to repeat it, because everybody can read it.
En fait, parce que ici, c'est le point clé, c'est-à-dire c'est la conclusion de mon travail.
Tu simple parole parce que
Oui, c'est bon. Non, vous pouvez rester. C'est mieux. Les? Okay.
Okay?
Can I move? Next, last slide.
Okay, last slide.
I'll wait.
Yeah, okay.
Because this is worked on well or not kind of.
Look at this then. If the translation is good.
Last point.
Okay. Slide.
Last slide. Okay.
It's okay.
Okay, it's not that easy to do this in 2 languages, but if we wouldn't do it in 2 languages, we wouldn't all be able to participate in this discussion. So we have to live with that fact. Our next speaker is Professor Mahmoud Sy, who is coming to us from the University of Sim Saloum El Hadi Ibrahima Niasse. That's a terrible, no, it's terrible, but you know, it's in Senegal. And Professor Sy has also been part of the global network. He was a participant in our first network conference in Brazil, where we talked about scales of global history. And he just published a really important book that I all recommend you to buy and read, La Vallée du Fleuve Sénégal dans les jeux des échelles politiques, which is a political, economic, social history of this region, this part of the world. Mamadou, you're next.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sven. Ma communication porte sur Dakar, capitale de l'AOF, port maritime intercontinental et les problèmes de sa police. Je voudrais donc dans ce papier partager avec vous. Ok, yeah. Donc, le titre de ma communication Dakar, capitale de l'AOF, port maritime intercontinental et les problèmes de sa police, 19e, 1925. Dans ce papier, donc, je voudrais partager avec vous les problèmes de la police dans la ville de Dakar, mais seulement pas dans la ville de Dakar, mais dans la colonie du Sénégal. Je dirais d'abord présenter la police dans le contexte colonial, dans les années 1920. La police, dans son entièreté, avait 200 agents, dont 30 Européens. Et la structure de la police coloniale sénégalaise, c'est la même structure que des polices coloniales dans les colonies britanniques, donc de la Gold Coast, de l'Afrique de l'Est, ou bien dans les colonies anglaises de l'Amérique, ou bien même dans les colonies hollandaises, comme à Suriname. Donc il y avait une hiérarchie, il y avait les Européens, qui étaient les chefs, et les Africains, la masse, à peu près 170 Africains, qui étaient donc les subalternes, c'était donc des gardes de police. Et je parle ici de la police urbaine, qu'on appelle Al-Qaïti en Wolof, donc différents des gardes cercles, qui sont les policiers ruraux. Et le principe de la gestion de cette police, donc la gestion de cette police, c'est gérer, surveiller les étrangers, faire la police chez les étrangers avec des étrangers. Donc, les policiers étaient, les chefs étaient des Européens et les subalternes étaient des non-originaires des villes où ils servaient. C'est en général ce qu'on appelle des lacs 4. Ils venaient en général du Haut-Sénégal, de la moyenne vallée du Sénégal, en général des Toucouleurs, des Bambara et des Soninké. Et ce même principe aussi se retrouve dans les polices coloniales anglaises, comme dans la Gold Coast, mais au Kenya. Mais là-bas, en Gold Coast, par exemple, les policiers subalternes étaient des Haoussa. Mais encore au Kenya, les policiers subalternes étaient des Indiens, donc qui venaient de l'Inde. Mais ici au Sénégal, on n'a pas eu donc cet apport de policiers subalternes qu'on a dans d'autres pays, mais ce sont des qui viennent donc de la colonie du Sénégal. Et cette police était donc payée par le budget colonial sénégalais, et les indemnités des policiers étaient payées par les communes où ces policiers servaient. Et revenant à la police de Dakar, donc Dakar fut un agglomérat de villages. Donc c'est en 1857 donc cet agglomérat de villages donc que les Français décidaient d'en faire un port de commerce. Et à partir donc, de 1858, il y a un plan cadastral. En 1902, Dakar devint donc la capitale. On transfère la capitale de l'AOF de Saint-Louis à Dakar. À partir de ce moment-là, Dakar va attirer des migrants. Parce que donc ici c'est Dakar, j'y reviendrai peut-être si j'ai le temps. Donc à partir de la fin du 19e siècle, il y a un afflux de ruraux qui vont à Dakar. Pourquoi? Parce que nous sommes à une période où les empires coloniaux, les royaumes coloniaux sont détruits par la colonisation. Il y a une déstructuration sociale et économique. Et il y a une circulation d'hommes libres et d'hommes d'anciens captifs qui vont à Dakar chercher du travail. Et face à cette affluence de migrants, les autorités de Dakar, principalement le maire de Dakar, le conseil de Dakar, le délégué intérieur de Dakar et donc le procureur de la République vont faire un échange épistolaire face à ce qu'ils appellent donc l'afflux de ces migrants qu'ils considéraient comme une population dangereuse, donc qu'ils appelaient donc population flottante. Et pour ces autorités, ces migrants étaient un danger. Ils les appelaient des vagabonds, des nomades. Et dans ce sens, la police coloniale va être utilisée comme un instrument de séparation raciale entre les migrants et les Européens qui étaient établis en général autour du port, dans le cadre qu'on appelle le plateau. Et la réaction donc, française va être donc, pour favoriser, sécuriser les habitats, l'habitat blanc. Et la police et les autorités politiques vont réorganiser la ville en 3 secteurs. Il y a le secteur du port, qui est le plus important, le plus stratégique, qui va être confié à la police et à la gendarmerie. Il y a le secteur du plateau qui va être confié à la police. Et il y a le secteur intermédiaire qu'on appelle la Médina, c'est le quartier en fait, des Noirs. Et il y aura donc une organisation, une sectorisation de la sûreté. Nous sommes au début du XXe siècle, donc cette politique de développement séparé des races qui n'est pas très éloignée de ce qui se passe dans d'autres horizons. Et la police donc va jouer ce rôle de séparation des races pour faire face à la criminalité. Et il y aura donc un recours aux gendarmes. Il y avait à ce moment-là moins de 200 policiers dans tout le Sénégal et il y avait seulement dans tout le Sénégal 62 gendarmes. Et une partie de ces gendarmes va être utilisée donc pour sécuriser Dakar. Et ces gendarmes donc vont aussi jouer un autre rôle. C'est au niveau du port de Dakar, les bateaux devaient être contrôlés. Il y avait donc tout un système de contrôle des voyages intercontinentaux, des voyageurs qui débarquent, à qui on donne des cartes de séjour, etc. Et il y aura un système de sécurisation aussi, de contrôle de l'espionnage. Et dans ce problème-là aussi, la police va jouer un rôle à Dakar dans les années, pendant la Première Guerre mondiale. Et après la Première Guerre mondiale, Dakar fait face à des épidémies, de fièvre jaune et de peste. Et la police va être utilisée pour eux aider les autorités à déporter les populations noires qui étaient mélangées avec les blancs, pour les déporter au-delà de la Médina. Parce que pour les blancs, pour les Européens, les noirs étaient les vecteurs de ces maladies. Et il y aura donc un second redéploiement de noirs au-delà de la Médina vers Niayes Thioker et au-delà même vers les bas-fonds qu'on appelle Pékin. Mais je ne dis pas que tous les migrants de Pékin ont été déportés pendant cette période, parce que dans les années 70 aussi, avec la sécheresse, beaucoup de migrants vont s'installer dans les zones qui étaient des bas-fonds. Et dans les années 80, on a vu les conséquences. Et la police aussi était sujette à un problème de budget. Mais le principe colonial, c'est assez mesquin parce que la police est une police faite pour le colon, faite pour le capital et pour défendre les capitalistes. Ce qui veut dire que la police, même dans son expansion, elle suit l'expansion du capitalisme. On voit donc un fort maillage sécuritaire le long des comptoirs commerciaux sur la ligne Dakar-Saint-Louis, la ligne ferroviaire, sur la ligne Dakar-Tambacounda, alors que tout le Sénégal continental n'avait pas de commissariat de police. Tous les commissariats étaient concentrés autour de la ligne ferroviaire et autour de la côte. Le Sénégal inutile donc. Le Sénégal inutile n'aura des postes de gendarmerie qu'à partir de 1931, lorsqu'il y aura une réforme de la justice, on aura donc des commissariats. Et même la banlieue de Dakar n'était pas sécurisée. Les villages de Ouakam, de Yor, de Tcharoy, de Anne auront plus tard, après 1931, des brigades de gendarmerie. Parce que la police était focalisée pour défendre les boutiques des Européens. Et pour chaque ouverture d'un poste de police, la chambre de commerce écrivait. Et si on lit la requête des commerçants, ils disent que nous sommes menacés par les Noirs, ils sont dangereux, ils sont voleurs. Et c'est pourquoi donc on ouvre un poste, pas pour défendre la population civile, pas pour défendre la population autochtone, mais pour défendre les Européens et leurs intermédiaires commerciaux qui sont les Libanons, Syriens. Donc, la police était sujette donc à un problème de crise de personnel. Et elle était, pendant toute la période coloniale, la police avait un sous-effectif. Et la parade fut donc de chercher souvent des militaires à la retraite pour pallier ce manque, ce sous-effectif, ou bien faire appel à ce qu'on appelle le commis expéditionnaire. Donc en guise de conclusion, je dirais que la police coloniale fut une police mal aimée par la population parce qu'elle ne servait pas les intérêts de la population locale, elle servait les intérêts d'une minorité. Et dans Dakar, cette police fut utilisée donc pour jouer ce rôle de distanciation entre la population blanche et la population noire. Dans ce cas, la police coloniale sénégalaise ressemble à beaucoup de polices comme la police créée par les migrants hollandais au XVIIe siècle dans la colonie du Cap. Donc un rôle de distanciation sociale et raciale. Sauf qu'en Afrique du Sud, au Cap, Van Riebeck fit appel à des miliciens et il agissait dans le monde rural. Alors ici à Dakar, la police agissait dans le milieu urbain. Donc il a fallu attendre les années 30 avec la réforme de la sécurité pour voir l'érection de postes de gendarmerie dans les zones délaissées par la police pendant au début du XXe siècle. Okay. Donc c'était cela, ce que je voulais partager avec vous. Je vous remercie beaucoup. Now let me do a very short abstract in English. My paper deals with the history of police in Senegal. Senegal police was created by French. It is an institution imported by French, and the high rank of the policemen was from French origin. They came here as officers coming from Police de Paris or Sécurité Nationale. And we have two periods in the history of the police in Senegal. Before 1825, we have like a militia or watchmen who was hired by traders. But after 1825, we have police, an official police, and it is in 1878 we have an agreement organizing the police in Senegal. And during these years of mid-20th century, all the policemen, all the high rank of the police was, the commissioners and the inspectors was white men from Europe. And the low rank, we have black, who are often strangers. But the main idea of policing in Senegal, or all colonial police in the world, was policing strangers by strangers. And the low rank of policemen was Fulani or Maninka or Soninke. It was a good politic to, to be harsh and hard with local population. And in Dakar, police was faced to many challenges because when French authorities decided to do Dakar as a harbor, they was faced to arrival of mass migration of population coming from the hinterland. This population at the end of the 19th century, we assist at the collapse of Senegalese kingdom, and we have also the collapse of economic and social organization. Many slaves escaped their masters and they was looking for freedom and for job. And when they arrive in Dakar, we have a mass migration of strangers. And we have in this, at the end of the 19th century, at the beginning of the 20th century, exchange of correspondences between the authorities, how to face to this arrival of population coming from the hinterland. The population from the hinterland was like a threat for the colonial authorities. And at the beginning of the 20th century, we have disease, two types of disease in Senegal, yellow fever and plague. And also this disease pushed the authorities, French authorities to separate the black and the man in the quarters. And the black was deported up to Avenue Maliksi in Medina village and furthermore in Pekin. And colonial police played a role, a tool to defend only a minority, the French and their brokers, the Lebanese and the Syrian. The policeman was paid by money from the colony, but they deserve the interest of the colony. That's the history of this colonial city. Focus on Dakar. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mamoudou, and thank you also for translating your own paper. I think these papers spoke to one another very clearly and very directly, and also the big animating questions of this conference. And I'm sure Rafael Marchese is now going to bring it all together and explain to us how to think about it. Rafael is a professor of history at the University of Sao Paulo in Brazil. He's one of the world's greatest experts on the history of second slavery in the Americas. And he also serves as the co-director of Mundi, the Global History Institution at the University of Sao Paulo. Rafael, great to have you. Just scream.
Okay, are you hearing? Yes. Yeah. Okay, I'm going without microphone. So thanks, Sven, for this kind of presentation. Thanks for all the network friends, and especially Babacar for organizing this wonderful meeting. So it was a pleasure to read the three papers, and now to listen to you presenting them. I have learned a lot, especially being a historian who works on the global history of New World slavery. And it means that I'm completely out of my immediate concerns here, but out of the time and space that I study. So thanks again for this opportunity to enlarge my knowledge. So basically, I learned a lot. I'm going to split my comments, which actually is not comments, but also questions, okay? In order to start generate the debate. At the same time, I will try to make some connections between the papers, even there are obvious convergence, especially at the end of my comments. I start with Michel. And first of all, this wasn't in your presentation. Bom Bahia, amazing, because I never figured out what was the origin of the name, Bom Bahia. And for sure my Bahian friends are going to envy this origin, okay? But I would like, Michel, to start with a historiographical and political trope, that comes from the 17th century that contrasts North Atlantic modernity versus Iberian backwardness. So if you go to the 16th century, you can see at the very origins of Black Legend, this political historiographical trope that counterpoints what was the modernity of the North and the backwardness of the Iberian world. In general, global histories of colonialism follow this trope, something due to the split between historiographical traditions. So we have Portuguese imperial histories on the one side and British imperial histories on the other side. And it's amazing how, are you listening to me? Okay? It's amazing how this split still operates within sort of. We just have to remember John Darwin's argument on the British word system. So it's a word system outside the real word system. Okay? And what your paper helps us is to question these traditions, as you show pretty well how Portuguese institutions were maintained by British colonialism in Bombay for a long time. So I would like to hear your thoughts on that. So, how your paper directly address this split between historiographical traditions. Okay? And the real change in the history you are telling us came only at the turn of the 19th century. So, I also want to ask you a direct question about what are the broader implications of that periodization? Should we imply a Foucauldian argument about the changing patterns of governmentality here? So, this argument about the big turn at the turn of the 19th century and about how to govern the subject, how to do biopolitics and so on. I'd like to to hear your thoughts about if it's possible to apply this framework to understand your work. Or, on the other hand, are we dealing with something that in a great extent produced by the inter-imperial rivalries? So I'm thinking about the Dutch East Indies Company, the French East Indies Company, the Mughal powers, the changing trajectories of imperial powers in the Americas, in the Atlantic, and a new conjuncture of the world system of European capitalism, which have demanded new responses on how to govern colonial subjects. So it's possible to frame your argument in both distinct direct ways. Foucauldian argument or this broader argument about inter-imperial rivalries. And it's important because we have just to remember that 1776 to 1779 is a crucial turning point in the story that you described as. 1857, it's another one. So how to weave these big events, the American Revolution, the American War, and then the big 1857 rising, into your analysis of policy movement. Okay? And finally, a suggestion. I think it's important for you to engage with the post-1980s Portuguese scholarship on the nature of the ancient regime powers. So I'm thinking about António Manuel Espanha, Nuno Monteiro, Diogo Ramada Couto, with their polycynal model of power and adapted to distinct colonial settings. So I didn't read these references, but I think it would be really useful for you to put that in our argument. Okay? Mamoudou, it's a pleasure to be again with you after our first meeting in São Paulo. And you deal, Mamoudou, with the very same topic of leadership, but your immediate dialogue with Larissa's paper. Okay? But I also would like to ask you, Mamoudou, a similar question that I made to Michel. How the broader changes in the economic and demographic profile of Dakar and the African political landscape, so sports, rural migration, labor unrest, at the beginning of the 20th century, relates to the story that you are telling us. There's a split between your paper and your presentation. So your paper offers us mainly an institutional history of policy in Dakar. But your presentation is much more broader than your paper. In a given way, you have dealt with what I'm asking you for in your presentation, but I would like to hear more from you on that. And I think, due to according to your presentation, that you're right. We cannot understand what was going on if you do not pay attention to material forces that were shaping these institutions. And this is also crucial to understand on the other way around how institutions shape the material forces. Specifically, I would like to hear you more from about the structural role of racism in the story that you are telling.